When Madison Blake strutted onto the stage, she carried herself like a warrior stepping onto the battlefield. She was here to win, not to debate. The auditorium was packed. Students from top universities across the country had gathered for what was supposed to be an evening of intellectual discourse. But Madison wasn't interested in discourse. She was here to burn the old world to the ground. Adjusting the microphone, she flashed a tight-lipped smirk and let her eyes sweep across the audience, lingering for a second on the tall, well-dressed figure in the third row, Barron Trump. She knew he was there. She had hoped he would be. She was going to make an example out of him. She cleared her throat and spoke, her voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Enough is enough. The room quieted. For too long we have been forced to live under the rule of people who are out of touch, who don't understand us, who don't even belong in the world we are trying to build. A ripple of agreement spread through the audience. Some students clapped lightly. Madison knew she had them in the palm of her hand. She leaned forward, her eyes glinting with challenge. Let's stop pretending. The older generations, the so-called wise leaders of our country, have done nothing but drag us backwards. They hide behind their family values, their patriotism, their religion, as if those things give them the right to dictate our future. Now the applause grew louder. Some students were nodding vigorously. In the third row, Barron Trump did not move. And let's talk about voting, Madison continued, her voice dripping with disgust. Why should someone who barely knows how to use a smartphone get to decide how the digital age is run? Why should people who won't even live to see the consequences of their decisions be allowed to make them? Gasps and cheers rippled through the audience. I'm saying what no one else has the guts to say. She took a step forward, gripping the podium. We need an age limit on political participation. No one over 50 should be allowed to vote. No one over 50 should be allowed to run for office. It's time to take our country back. The auditorium erupted into applause. Some students stood, cheering her on. Madison soaked it in, feeling the momentum of the crowd. But then, a single voice cut through the chaos. Deep, calm, unshaken. I would like to respond to that. The audience froze. All heads turned toward the source of the voice. In the third row, Barron Trump rose from his seat, his face unreadable. Madison's smirk widened. Oh, look, she said into the microphone, her voice dripping with mockery. Daddy's little prince has something to say. Laughter spread through the crowd, but Barron didn't react. He straightened his suit, walked to the second podium, adjusted the microphone, and met Madison's gaze. Then, with a calm confidence that no one expected, he began. The energy in the room shifted. Madison Blake had controlled the debate, until now. Barron Trump stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone with deliberate patience. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't angry. He was calculating, and that unsettled Madison. She had expected rage, maybe frustration, but not this. Barron took a moment, letting the silence stretch. He could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes on him. Students, journalists, professors, all waiting to see how he would respond. Finally, he spoke. Madison, I appreciate your passion, he began, his voice deep, smooth, unwavering. But passion without wisdom is like a ship without a rudder, powerful, but dangerous. A murmur ran through the audience. Madison's smirk faltered for just a second. Barron leaned slightly forward, his gaze locked onto hers. You claim that older generations have failed us, that they should be stripped of their right to vote, to lead, that they are outdated, irrelevant. But let me ask you who built the very system you're standing on right now. Madison crossed her arms, her confidence returning. A system built on oppression and privilege, she shot back. Barron didn't blink. A system that gave you the education you're using to attack it. A system that provides you with the technology, the infrastructure, the freedoms you take for granted. You use their inventions, their advancements, their sacrifices, and yet you call them outdated? Some students in the audience nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. Madison wasn't going to let this go. She rolled her eyes, stepping closer to the microphone. "Let's not romanticize the past, Barron," she sneered. "This great generation you worship. They fought against progress at every turn. They resisted civil rights. They opposed LGBTQ rights. They refused to acknowledge climate change. And now they cling to their faith, their guns, their outdated values, as if the world isn't moving on without them." A roar of applause exploded from her supporters. Madison fed off the energy. "And you," she turned back to Barron, her eyes narrowing. "You were born into wealth, into privilege. What could you possibly know about struggle, about fighting for the future?" She folded her arms, looking at him like she had already won. But Barron, he just smiled, not a smirk, not arrogance. Just pure, calculated confidence. Then, in a voice that was clear, steady, and razor-sharp, he delivered his counterstrike. "Tell me, Madison, if your entire argument is about fighting oppression, then why does it sound so much like you're advocating for a new kind of discrimination?" The audience froze. For the first time that night, Madison had no immediate response. Barron had just flipped the script, and now he was in control. The tension in the room was electric. Barron's words hung in the air like a challenge, daring Madison to respond. For the first time, she hesitated. She hadn't expected him, the son of Donald Trump, the golden boy of America's most controversial political family, to outmaneuver her this quickly. But she wasn't about to back down. She gripped the edges of the podium, forcing a smirk. "Oh, please, Barron," she scoffed. "Discrimination? That's rich coming from someone who grew up in a golden tower. Do you even hear yourself? You think a few fancy words erase centuries of oppression?" The crowd roared in agreement. Madison straightened her posture, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's get real. Your entire life has been a privilege. You've never had to fight for anything. And now you stand there, defending the same outdated system that keeps people like you on top while the rest of us suffer." A wave of applause spread through her supporters. She felt her confidence creeping back. She leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. "Tell me, Barron, what exactly have you ever struggled for?" She crossed her arms, waiting for him to stumble. But Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly shook his head, almost amused. Then, in a calm, measured voice, he replied, "Madison, you keep talking about privilege. Let's talk about yours. Silence." The energy in the room shifted. Madison blinked. "Excuse me." Barron gestured to the auditorium, his voice unwavering. "You stand here, on this stage, at one of the best universities in the world. You're holding a microphone, broadcasting your opinions without fear of being silenced. You have the freedom to attack people who disagree with you, knowing that nothing will happen to you because of it." His blue eyes locked onto hers. "You call that oppression?" A hush spread through the crowd. Some of Madison's supporters glanced at each other, unsure how to react. Madison's smirk faltered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, so now I'm privileged," she shot back, rolling her eyes. "You don't get it, do you? Freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. People like you get to say whatever you want without ever facing backlash, while people like me have to fight to be heard." Barron let out a slow breath. "Fight to be heard?" he repeated, tilting his head. "Madison, you're not fighting to be heard. You're fighting to silence everyone who doesn't agree with you." The audience shifted. A few heads nodded. Others murmured. Madison's jaw clenched. "That's not what I'm doing." Barron didn't let her escape. "Isn't it?" he asked, his voice cool and precise. "You stand here calling for entire groups of people to be stripped of their rights, because of their age, because of their beliefs, because they don't fit into your vision of progress." He took a step closer to the microphone. "That's not progress, Madison. That's just a new form of tyranny." The crowd stiffened. Madison's fingers curled around the edge of the podium. For the first time, she felt like she was losing. She needed to hit back, hard. And so, in a desperate attempt to regain control, she did what many before her had done. She made it personal. Madison could feel the shift. She was losing the room. Barron Trump, the person she had expected to humiliate, was turning the debate against her. Her supporters weren't cheering as loudly anymore. Some of them were even listening to him. She couldn't let that happen. So she did what many before her had done. She made it personal. "You know what, Barron?" She sneered, stepping closer to the microphone. "It must be nice to stand there and preach about fairness when you were literally born into wealth and power. You've never had to work for anything in your life." She spun toward the audience, her voice rising. "Look at him. The billionaire's son, acting like he understands struggle. Like he understands what it's like to be silenced, to be ignored, to be marginalized. You are the very definition of privilege." Applause erupted again. Madison felt her confidence return. She turned back to Barron, her eyes burning with triumph. "Tell me, Barron," she challenged, her voice dripping with mockery. "When was the last time you actually had to fight for anything?" She folded her arms, waiting for him to stumble, to break. But Barron Trump didn't even blink. Instead, he took a slow breath, then leaned slightly forward. "You say I don't know what it's like to be silenced?" His voice was quiet but deadly sharp. "That's ironic. Coming from someone who spent this entire debate trying to silence others." The audience froze. Madison's smirk faltered. Barron's gaze never wavered. "You want to talk about privilege?" He continued. "Let's talk about yours." Madison blinked. "Excuse me?" Barron's voice was measured, calm, and surgical. His blue eyes locked onto hers. "Tell me, Madison, if you're so oppressed, why is it that the people you claim to be fighting against are the only ones who aren't allowed to speak?" Silence. Madison froze. Some of her supporters shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances. Others looked uncomfortable. Madison's hands curled into fists. She refused to let him win, so she went for the kill. She took a deep breath, forced a smirk back onto her lips, and went for the one thing she was sure would shatter him. "You're just like your father, aren't you?" she spat. The audience gasped. She saw Barron's expression harden just for a fraction of a second. "Good." She pressed forward. "All this talk about fairness, about listening to other people, but at the end of the day, you're just another Trump. Another privileged, spoiled rich kid who doesn't care about real Americans, who doesn't care about anyone but himself." She folded her arms, staring him down. "Prove me wrong." The audience held its breath. For the first time, the debate wasn't just about politics anymore. It was personal, but Madison had made a huge mistake. Because Barron Trump was ready for this. And his next words would destroy her. The air in the auditorium was thick with tension. Madison Blake stood tall, her arms crossed, staring down Barron Trump with pure defiance. "Prove me wrong," she had challenged. She thought she had landed the knockout punch. That by dragging his father into this, she had rattled him. But Barron Trump, he just exhaled slowly. Then, in a voice that was low, steady, and razor-sharp, he spoke. "You want me to prove you wrong, Madison? Fine. Let's start with the biggest lie you just told." Madison blinked. "Excuse me?" Barron took a step forward, never breaking eye contact. "You claim I don't care about real Americans. That my family doesn't. That we don't understand struggle. But tell me, Madison, what exactly have you done for this country?" Silence. A shift rippled through the crowd. Barron kept going. "You stand here, lecturing me about privilege while enjoying every single benefit of the system you pretend to hate. You attend one of the most elite universities in the country. You have a platform. You have the full support of the media, of academia, of the very institutions you claim are against you." His voice dropped lower, but somehow carried even more weight. "And yet, you call yourself oppressed." A few students in the crowd stiffened. Some exchanged glances. Madison's smirk wavered. "That's not." "No, let's really break this down." Barron cut her off, his tone still composed. You talk about struggling, about fighting against the system, but when was the last time you actually helped someone other than yourself? Asterisk, asterisk. Madison clenched her jaw. Barron tilted his head slightly. You call me privileged. Maybe I am. But you know what I've done with that privilege? I've spent years working with charities, helping veterans, supporting families who actually struggle every single day. Meanwhile, you spend your time debating on stages like this, pretending to be a revolutionary, while attacking the very people who built the society that lets you speak freely. The audience was no longer just listening. They were re-evaluating. Madison could feel it. Barron delivered the final blow. You say I'm just like my father. That's interesting. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, his blue eyes locked onto hers. Because you're exactly like the people who hate him. Loud, angry, obsessed with tearing others down, but never building anything yourself. The audience gasped. For the first time in the entire debate, Madison had no comeback. Her supporters weren't cheering. Some looked confused. Others just sat there, arms crossed, watching her struggle to find words. Barron Trump had just done something no one had ever done before. He had made her speechless. And in that moment, the debate was over. Madison Blake was cornered. For the first time in her debating career, she had no immediate comeback. No pre-rehearsed talking points, no sharp insults to throw back. Barron Trump had dismantled her argument piece by piece, exposing her for what she truly was, a performer, not a revolutionary. And the worst part? The audience knew it. The sane students who had been cheering her on minutes ago now sat in uncomfortable silence. A few whispered to each other. Others avoided her gaze. She felt it, the loss of control. She couldn't let this happen, not to him. So she did what people do when they have nothing left. She lashed out. Madison grabbed the microphone with both hands, her voice rising. You're twisting everything I said. This isn't about me, Barron. This is about the millions of people who have suffered because of people like your father. Because of people like you. She gestured wildly to the audience. You all know I'm right. These so-called patriots, they've ruined this country. They've taken everything from us. And now you want to sit here and pretend like we owe them respect, like we owe them anything? Some of her supporters clapped, but the applause was scattered hesitant. Barron simply tilted his head, watching her. Madison's face was red now. She wasn't debating anymore, she was ranting. And she knew it. She turned back to him, breathing heavily, her hands tightening around the podium. You think you won? She hissed. You think one little speech makes you right? Barron didn't blink. Instead, he leaned forward ever so slightly and spoke in a voice so calm, so precise, that it cut through the tension like a knife. Madison, I never needed to win this debate. Silence. The audience froze. Barron took a slow breath, then delivered the final blow. You did that for me. Madison's eyes widened. Because this entire debate, you weren't proving me wrong. You were proving me right. He straightened his tie, his gaze locked onto hers. You claimed you were here to promote tolerance, yet you've spent the last 20 minutes attacking millions of Americans simply because they believe differently than you. A few heads in the audience nodded. You claim to stand for the younger generation, yet the only thing you've done tonight is demand that an entire group of people be silenced simply because of their age. More whispers. Some students were fully turned toward each other now, discussing what he had just said. And you claim to fight against oppression, Barron continued. Yet when challenged, all you did was try to silence me with personal attacks. You didn't debate me. You tried to destroy me. Madison's face drained of color. She turned to the audience, desperate now. Come on, you're not actually listening to him, are you? She searched for her supporters, for the energy, the blind agreement that had always fueled her before. But something was different this time. The audience wasn't cheering anymore. They weren't nodding along. Some were looking at her with pity. Others looked disappointed. She had lost them. She had lost everything. And Barron Trump? He hadn't even needed to raise his voice. The debate was over. But Madison wasn't ready to accept it. And what she did next would shock the entire room. The debate was over. The audience had seen through Madison Blake. She had gone from a confident debater to a ranting ideologue, and Barron Trump had calmly exposed every flaw in her argument. But Madison? She refused to accept it. Her hands gripped the podium so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced. She had to do something. Then she snapped. She turned to Barron, her voice sharp, bitter, filled with venom. "You're just a coward, Barron." She spat, "Hiding behind your family name, pretending to be better than the rest of us. But let's be honest, if your last name wasn't Trump, you'd be nothing." The audience gasped. Even Madison's supporters shifted uncomfortably. She had just crossed a line, but she wasn't done. "You want to talk about privilege?" She shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "You think people respect you? They don't respect you, Barron. They fear your father. That's the only reason you're even standing here. You're not some great debater. You're just another spoiled rich kid with a famous last name." Her voice echoed through the auditorium. Silence. No one was clapping now. Even the students who had been on her side were looking at her in disbelief. She had lost control. Completely. And Barron Trump? He just stood there, unmoved, unshaken, untouchable. Then, after a moment, he took a slow breath and leaned into the microphone. And with 5 words, he ended her career forever. "That's all you have left?" Madison froze. Barron tilted his head slightly, almost amused. "That's your big finish?" he said, his voice dripping with quiet confidence. "You lost the debate, so now you're just throwing insults?" He took a step back from the podium, shaking his head. "You just proved my point, Madison." The audience was silent. Barron turned slightly, gesturing toward the crowd. "She started this debate claiming to fight for tolerance, for fairness, for progress." His blue eyes flicked back to her. "But when challenged, she did what every radical ideologue does. She resorted to personal attacks, hoping that would be enough to win." Barron exhaled slowly, his voice steady. "Madison, this was never a debate for you. It was an execution. You didn't come here to defend ideas, you came here to destroy people. And in the end, the only thing you destroyed was yourself." A heavy silence filled the room. Madison's hands were shaking. She opened her mouth to say something, anything. But no words came out. Then, the audience erupted. But not for her. They were clapping. For him. Even some of Madison's own supporters hesitated, then joined in. It wasn't just applause. It was a standing ovation. Madison staggered back from the podium, her face pale. She had lost. Completely. Barron simply nodded politely to the crowd, then turned and walked off the stage. The debate was over. And his legacy had just begun. Barron Trump walked off the stage, his step steady, his presence unshaken. Madison Blake stood frozen at the podium. Her hands gripped the edges, but there was nothing left to hold on to. She had come to win. Instead, she had been exposed. The room was silent. The crowd that had cheered for her before now sat still, their expressions unreadable. A few clapped, but not for her. Barron had done what no one expected. He hadn't just won the debate. He had ended it. What do you think? Did Barron prove his point, or did Madison have a case? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more. Turn on notifications so you never miss what's next.